We're delighted to have Professor Timur Kuran from Duke University here with us this evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Timur Kuran, I'm sure you are all familiar, but let me nevertheless do a quick introduction, is a professor of economics and political science and Gorter Family Professor of Islamic Studies at Duke University. His research focuses on economic, political, and social change, with emphasis on institutions and preferences, and the economic and political history of the Middle East, with a focus on the role of Islam. Today, he's going to be presenting a joint paper with Serkan Adıgüzel, who is also here with us today, on the Islamic Waqf. And I've learned quite a lot, to be honest, by reading the paper, and I'm sure we will be all learning more about the Waqf at the end of this presentation. Let me also say a few sentences about the format of the seminar before we start. So the seminar will be a 1-hour uninterrupted talk. If you have clarification questions, I'd like to ask you to type them on the chat screen, and I'll communicate the clarification questions to Timur Hocam. Otherwise, we'd like to ask you to save your questions to the Q&A at the end, where we're hoping to have productive discussions. Thank you so much again, Timur Hocam, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. As Gözde said, this is a joint paper with Serkan Adıgüzel, who's completing his PhD at Duke. He's spending this year on a pre-doc at Harvard. He specializes in political economy and methodology. One strand of his research deals with the political economy of media, another with the provision of public goods, and as Gözde said, he's with us in this Zoom room. Our joint paper is about an institution that was central to the pre-modern economy of the Ottoman Empire, or the wider Middle East. It's the Waqf. Waqf is the anglicized version of Waqf, and I'm going to be using that term. More precisely, the paper is about the Islamic Waqf as opposed to the modern Waqf. I'll make the distinction in a bit. The Islamic Waqf played a key role in the economic successes of the Middle East and the Balkans during the Middle Ages. It was central also to the area's eventual fall into underdevelopment. Now, in Istanbul, evidence, where most of you are, evidence of the Waqf's significance is ubiquitous in parts of the city built before 1800. A very large share of the surviving buildings from before the 19th century were founded as waqfs. In this picture, I'm sure you will all recognize it. Every building except for this one was financed as a waqf. You have a hammam in the foreground, the madrasa here, the edge of the Sultan Ahmet Mosque to right in that corner. So let's make sure we all know what Waqf is, and also what makes a Waqf Islamic. An Islamic Waqf is a trust formed under Islamic law. It's established to deliver a designated set of services. The founder is an individual property owner. The purpose is to use the income from the endowed property to deliver a service or a stipulated set of services forever, in perpetuity. The Waqf is managed by a caretaker, a mutevelli. The caretaker manages the Waqf on behalf of the founder according to rules registered by the founder. It is not, this is important to recognize, it is not a self-governing organization like a charitable corporation, and we'll come back to this. In 1208, Said Battal Gazi founded a külliye in Eskişehir. He stipulated that it would have a school, a hospital, a public kitchen, and so on. In 1708, a half a millennium later, the caretaker of the külliye had to manage it as instructed. Now, departures, of course, did occur, but this was the rule, and departures were costly. Now, the Waqf is not one of Islam's original institutions. It's not mentioned in the Quran. It emerged a century after the rise of Islam to meet a demand by high officials whose wealth consisted primarily of land. They wanted to secure their property rights, and two characteristics of the Waqf turned it into a vehicle for protecting property rights, for making the Waqf a wealth shelter. All Waqf was considered sacred, and Waqf property and its income ordinarily were exempt from taxation. Now, these characteristics did not emerge out of the blue. They were transplanted from pre-Islamic civilization, specifically Roman and Persian practices. What matters here is that the belief in the sacredness of Waqf assets made rulers think twice before confiscating Waqf assets. Why? It would make them look impious. It would damage, and that would of course damage their legitimacy. When the Sultan expropriated Waqf properties, high officials protested because the precedent threatened their own endowments. This also gave Waqf property security. So the Waqf's immunity to confiscation became credible for these two reasons. Waqf properties became, in fact, fairly secure in an environment where ordinary property was vulnerable. The Waqf became part of the institutional complex in all pre-modern states governed under Islamic law. And it created huge incentives to convert private property into Waqfs. And there are some estimates from the Ottoman Empire at various dates and from various provinces also of the Ottoman Empire. They show that 25 to 60% of all land and buildings were held by Waqfs. So this gives you a sense of the enormous significance. Now, the services provided by a Waqf could be just about anything allowed under Islamic law. This might be a mosque, a school. You see in the picture, medrese that was financed by a Waqf located in Gebze. It could be a lighthouse, it could be a library, it could be a water fountain, a road, a public kitchen, aşevi. There are examples of social, or rather, these are examples of social services that are consumed primarily by others. They constitute philanthropy or charity. But the service could also involve private goods. You, as a property owner, say as the owner of farmland, could endow the farmland and stipulate that the income would be for yourself for the rest of your life. You could make a Waqf out of a home. Imagine it's this yalı. This is your home. You convert the yalı into a Waqf and stipulate in its deed, in its vakfiye, that you yourself are to live in this building, in this yalı, until you die, and then your children will live in it, and then your grandchildren, and so on. You could endow, alternatively, some shops at Kapalı Çarşı and say the rental income will be used to have someone recite the Quran for 3 hours every day for the benefit of your soul forever. Now, the last three are examples of private goods. The question, and of course, the first, as I already said, the first few are philanthropy or charity. The question that immediately comes to mind is, how common was each category? Now we'll get to this, but note here how much broader the Islamic Waqf's range of uses is relative to the Roman and Persian trusts that inspired it. The Roman and Persian trusts financed temples, religious structures. Muslims, starting in the 8th century, extended the range to include non-religious services. The examples of endowed services that are shown here, the examples that I've given, they can be divided alternatively according to whether they are meant to deliver utility in this world or in the next. Prayers for one's soul stands out as an investment solely for the hereafter. So we'll be exploring who founded such waqfs. Now, but before going any further, we need a typology for clarity about this, about our topic. And this is a different typology that Serkan and I have developed than one that you find in the literature. Thousands of waqfs, of course, exist in Turkey today. Among them is the KHAS Waqf that supports KHAS University, that finances cultural activities, that runs seminars like this one. This is a fundamentally different type of organization than what we're discussing here. It's a modern waqf as opposed to the Islamic waqf, which is the subject of this paper. Just to give perspective, a modern waqf is established under secular law. It is not overseen by Sharia courts. It is structurally much more flexible. The management of the KHAS Waqf regularly redirects resources to new areas. It has a board of trustees that decides how resources will be spent within general guidelines, but with a lot of authority itself. The founders do not micromanage its activities. There's a separation between daily management and giving broad direction. Structurally, the KHAS Waqf is far closer to an American charitable foundation than to the Islamic Waqf. It's more like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation than like the Waqf of the Çoban Mustafa Pasha Medrese in Gebze. So keep that in mind as we go on. Now, an Islamic Waqf has two main types, which much of the literature confuses. The two are often treated as a single institution, but we distinguish between state waqfs and regular waqfs. What makes either type Islamic is that its deed, its waqfiyeh, is certified as compatible with Islamic law, and then it is operated under Islamic law. Now, starting with the left branch, the state waqf, the state waqf is founded by a member of the ruling family. In Istanbul, of course, this would be the House of Osman, or a very high official such as the Sadrazam. The deed was usually ratified by the chief mufti, the Shaykhul Islam, occasionally by others. The deed of a state waqf was housed at the palace, usually kept in the treasury. State waqfs controlled enormous, like all of these that I showed you earlier, they were all state waqfs. They controlled enormous resources and they financed major social services, public baths, mosques, public kitchens, schools, hospitals, water lines into the city, and so on. Prior to the mid-19th century, no Ottoman municipality, no Ottoman city had a municipality or private public utilities like water companies. There were no state agencies supplying public goods like a health ministry that operated hospitals. There was no Ministry of Education. State waqfs substituted for a municipality for state agencies and public utilities. Whether they did so efficiently or not, that's a separate question that I've dealt with in in other papers. Our focus is going to be different, is different here. Images of state waqfs, of course, I've already shown you some in earlier slides, but here's another to cement the idea. The Süleymaniye Mosque and all the buildings that are surrounding it formed a charitable complex that delivered various services designated in Süleyman the Magnificent's Waqf deed. Altogether, they formed a massive state waqfs, one of the biggest in the empire. Now, let's move to the right branch here, the regular waqf. Regular waqfs are those founded ordinarily by someone outside the Sultan's inner circle. Palace men and women occasionally founded them too. They're relatively small waqfs. Sometimes they formed as regular waqfs. The deed was ratified by a judge, not a top-ranking state official, and it was recorded in a court register, not in a document held at the palace. For example, the vakfiye of regular waqf would be housed at the Galata court or the Üsküdar court. Typically, the size of its income-producing endowment was more modest relative to that of a state waqf like that of the Süleymaniye Külliye. Its endowment could consist of rent-generating real estate, which made it a classic waqf, or interest-yielding cash, which made it a cash waqf. These are the main types of regular waqfs. Now, an obvious question is, what role did these regular waqfs play in Ottoman life and in the Ottoman economy? Now, the scholarly literature on Ottoman waqfs is vast, which is not surprising given the weight of waqfs in the Ottoman economy. Collectively, you learn from this literature that waqfs served a variety of functions. This is not new. But the literature is confusing even on the distinction between Islamic waqfs and modern waqfs, which I've already made. Many authors write as though today's waqfs represent a revival of an old institution, which is just not correct. There's confusion on Ottoman waqfs as well. There's been no systematic analysis of whether what we're calling regular waqfs differed functionally from state waqfs. Is the difference simply a matter of scale, that Kanuni established a massive waqf and somebody of modest means established a small waqf? Are there no other differences? Who founded the regular waqfs? From the literature, we learn that a substantial share of state waqfs were founded by mothers and wives of sultans. Were women prominent among regular waqf founders as well? Were the men and women who established regular waqfs mostly elites, people of social status, not necessarily a part of the Sultan's family, but still people of a lot of influence, a lot of wealth? Or did commoners, the re'aya, did they participate as well? Did they participate in different ways when they founded waqfs? Leading historians treat waqfs of all kinds as instruments of charity and philanthropy. They treat wealth sheltering, establishing wealth for one's own and one's family's benefit as the exception. Is that correct? And did these organizations lower inequality? Could they have been instruments of inequality? Were they expressions of Islamic teachings to be generous and compassionate, as many people, many scholars have argued? So I'm going to give you the main findings, then we're going to see our data sources and some descriptive statistics, and then we'll have some analysis. So our main findings are the following. On the functions of regular waqfs, we find that most were founded to shelter wealth. They involved endowing property for the benefit of the founder and his or her family without paying taxes and with little risk of expropriation. Philanthropy, providing either religious or secular public goods or social services, generally semi-public goods, was a secondary function. As for charity, helping the poor, it was a minor function. Our data undermine the common claim that historically Waqfs were egalitarian institutions that redistributed from rich to poor. What about the identities of the founders? Waqf founding patterns differed across status groups. Elite founders were more likely to supply social services than commoner founders, and socially vulnerable groups, women and converts were among them, were more likely to use the Waqf to shelter wealth. We'll say more about this in a moment. And Waqfs, finally, Waqfs established specifically to expiate people's sins, favored founders. They did this through eternal prayer recitations, financing, Quran readings, through payments that were in principle to last forever. They were designed, these Waqfs were designed to extend temporal inequalities to the next world, to make worldly inequalities eternal. And we'll come back to this as well. So the setting is for the study is Istanbul, from the conquest to the Republic. Istanbul was the world's biggest city by 1650. During most of the period, it was in the top 5, most of the period we're going to cover, for the conquest of the Republic. It was in the top 5 in population. It held, this is quite interesting, it held about 3% of the Ottoman population, but 21% of all Ottoman Waqfs were established in Istanbul. So we're examining Waqfs in a place where they were unusually important. And this was also a place where the Waqf was seen as an impressive vehicle of public finance. Almost up to the 1800s, visitors were favorably impressed by Istanbul's living standards. And of course, Waqfs had a lot to do with this. Our data come from 3 sources. We use Waqf census from 1600 that covers Waqfs up to established up to 1599. There's a catalog of deeds prepared by ISAM, an Islamic Research Institute. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it in Bağlarbaşı. This catalog lists the surviving deeds by court and register number and where in the court register and which pages they're found. They don't have the deeds themselves; those we have to look. But at least they gave us a way to get a representative sample and to find them in the many thousands of registers to find the Vakfiye's. And we have close to 50 court registered that we ourselves have digitized in their entirety. We've used them as well. All these sources cover exclusively regular Waqfs, and jointly they give us a master data set of more than 12,000 Waqfs. Now, from these, we can determine the time trend of regular Waqf foundings, which you see in this diagram. This is the Waqfs founded per year. You see, and this goes from the conquest all the way to the Republic. You can see that new foundings rise till about 1650, and then they start losing popularity. We can discuss the underlying forces if you want in Q&A. Note that that classic waqfs lead the decline, those in red. You can see cash waqfs remain popular for a while, have a second peak, but then they also decline when various reforms start in the 19th century. Now, from this master set, we've chosen a random sample of 2,387 cases to study in great detail. The founders in our sample are 2/3 male, which indicates that women formed a substantial share of regular waqfs as well. Almost 3/4 of our founders had honorific titles, indicating that they were elites. Almost all the waqfs were founded by a Muslim, which is unsurprising. Under Islamic law, Muslims could form a waqf at will, but Christians and Jews needed special permission, which was granted only in return for a fee, and large fee, which is why in a city which was, depending on the year, 40 to 45%, even more non-Muslim, had very few non-Muslim founded waqfs. Now,
sorry for interrupting.
Yes,
quick
of course.
clarification question. Ulash is asking, are these the surviving waqfs or all those founded over time?
These are the ones founded over time, not necessarily. I mean, some of them, many of them were nationalized when a Waqf ministry was Efkaf Nezareti in 1826. So they didn't necessarily survive as independent, but we are looking actually at the foundings. Okay, and this is, and actually, of course, some registers have disappeared. We estimate that about 16,000 waqfs were actually founded, 4,000 waqfiyas have disappeared in floods and so on, or were not maintained. But it wasn't systematic. So we think we have a pretty representative sample of all the waqfs established.
Now,
so,
also,
yes.
The Waqf census, the one the first period, for the first period, that's the all Waqfs that was available when this census was conducted, which was 1600.
Thanks, Akram. So here's a distribution of the functions financed through Waqf deeds. Self-support is by far the largest category. 3/4 of all Waqfs stipulate support for the founder and or the founder's relatives. Religious functions were also important. We distinguish between Quran reading and other religious functions. Other religious functions would be financing a mosque or some kind of mosque service like illumination of a mosque. Poor support, notice this, is a very minor category. Here's the same breakdown, but distinguishing between classic waqfs and cash waqfs. What jumps out is that founders favored the classic waqf for when they were sheltering wealth for themselves. And what would the reason be? Real estate was more durable than cash. Evidently, founders seeking security for themselves picked the less risky form of the regular waqf. But with services, they tend to prefer the cash waqf, which provided a little bit more flexibility, at least on the investment side. In popular understandings of the waqf, secular services play an important role. There are books written about a single soup kitchen or a single hospital founded by an Ottoman Sultan's relative. Now, what did the worldly services of regular waqfs consist of? Here's the breakdown. The vast majority were services targetable at one's own neighborhood, even one's own street. Fountains were by far most common, followed by tax payment waqfs. These were waqfs that paid people's taxes. So the motive was rarely just philanthropy. The categories that form in that we would categorize as philanthropy were quite rare, actually, for in the case of regular waqfs. Now, water fountains that, of course, were the most important of the social services that I mentioned. They've been studied in a forthcoming paper by Aslı Cansunar. It's a paper coming out in April. She finds that the founder's household often benefited disproportionately because the location of the fountain was chosen for the convenience of the founder's household. The fountain was placed near the founder's residence, allowing him or her to draw piped water into private spaces. This one was this is an old fountain in Fatih. It was, and this is the wall of an old building that has not survived. Only the cheshme was left. This was against the wall of an old building, and it provided piped water for the founder's home. A tax relief waqf, known as Avariz Waqf, usually it served as a cover for pooling the resources of capital owners. It earned joint income through lending and then paid the owner's taxes due. So you can see, again, this is not philanthropy, this is serving the founder himself or herself. Since generations of researchers have treated the waqf also as an instrument of charity and redistribution, it's useful to compare two variables that Serkan and I construct: founder family support and maximal poor support. The first is the union of benefits solely to oneself or one's family. And the second is the union of benefits for the poor. It includes public kitchens, but I should point out that in public kitchens that have been studied, the poor got food only if any was left over after dignitaries had eaten. So an aşevi was not actually, an Ottoman aşevi was not something that was built to feed the poor only. It fed people according to social status, and the poor were at the end of the line. Also, the term poor was understood to include clerics in Ottoman, the ulema in Ottoman usage. So this term here gives an upper bound to funds directed at the poor. Even with this very liberal definition, we see we've tilted these in favor of poor support and against self-support. Even with this definition, you see that founder family support is 12 times more common than poor support, which is quite amazing when you know, in relation to the received literature. Now, the Waqf deed stipulated, in addition to primary functions, contingent functions. They stated where resources would go, for example, if a family line came to an end. The poor appear relatively more often as contingent beneficiaries, but when we combine all waqfs naming the poor as either primary or contingent beneficiaries, the share is no higher than 1/5. I should point out that these contingencies, many of them rarely became relevant because family lines often didn't come to an end. So the poor, even if they were a contingent beneficiary, never actually benefited. Now, let's turn to analysis using OLS regressions. Wealth sheltering is a way of gaining material security. We would expect socially vulnerable groups to need it more. Now, one vulnerable group is females. They lacked mobility. They were handicapped in courts. They inherited less under the Islamic inheritance system. They did not work for pay as men did. Indeed, we find that being female significantly raises the likelihood of sheltering wealth, even in the presence of various control. And this is, we have many specifications. This is the most demanding of all the specifications. Depending on the specification, being female raises the likelihood of sheltering wealth by 8 to 10%. Now, Christians converted as children to Islam and brought to Istanbul. They lacked local roots, which made them vulnerable. Christians or Jews who converted as adults were widely suspected of converting opportunistically to benefit from Muslim privileges, legal privileges, social privileges, and so on, economic privileges. That made them legally vulnerable. In most specifications, convert status, in fact, in all of our other specifications, convert status raises the likelihood of sheltering wealth. In this most demanding specification, we have the right sign and near significance. Wars make everyone vulnerable because, and why is that? Because the Sultan's need for revenue rises, and that means a higher likelihood of expropriation. War years, a significant predictor, not at the 95% level, but at the 90% level of significance. So let's look now at worldly social services or worldly philanthropy. High elites, either male or female, were closely connected to the palace, were more likely to supply social services. The literature is packed with claims. You see that here. The literature is packed with claims that the Waqf, especially those founded as philanthropic or charitable, expressed piety. If that were the case, we'd see more Waqfs founded in the month of Ramadan because religiosity rises then. There's a big literature on religiosity, changing behavior during Ramadan. There are many studies, but we find here that the Ramadan variable is insignificant. We also tested for the month before Ramadan, for the month of Shaban, that's also insignificant. So this discredits the claim, we think, that Waqf founding was a religious act, that religious motives were driving their founding. Now, with regard to religiosity, you might think that it would manifest itself in a greater propensity to finance religious public goods as opposed to what you might call secular public goods, using today's language. We find something quite interesting. Look at our two status groups, females and high elites, that in earlier slides you saw emerged as behaving unusually. Let's compare the propensities of females and high elites to found religious and non-religious public goods. We find no difference for females, look at this, and no difference for high elites. The blue here, the blue estimates show the worldly social services, and the red are the religious social services. Neither group tilts in favor of religious public goods or non-religious public goods. But let's now do the same comparison with self-support, worldly, involving material wealth, or otherworldly, through endowed prayers. You can support yourself in your afterlife, or aim to support yourself in the afterlife through endowed prayers for yourself, for your own soul. Females differ from males on worldly self-support, and that is because they feel more vulnerable, that's suggested, but not on otherworldly self-support. Evidently no reason for females to feel more vulnerable than males in the next world, or less vulnerable than males in the next world. High elites, on the other hand, do not differ from others in worldly self-support, but they do on otherworldly self-support. It's exactly the opposite as females. So what's the logic here? High elites are secure in this world. They're wealthy, but they're vulnerable in the next. They can't take their wealth and status with them. Perhaps they've become wealthy through corruption, and they feel vulnerable in the next world, and they have money to invest in help in the next world. And they do so, they try to help themselves in the hereafter by financing prayers for their souls, and they also finance prayers for the souls of their family members, trying to help them in the next world. I've already mentioned that Waqf deeds often had contingent clauses. Functions were stipulated would become effective at the occurrence of a certain event, like the death of a founder. The founder dies, the Waqf deed would if the founder had was sheltering wealth, what would happen to that wealth when he or she died? Well, this graph summarizes all the contingencies. You have the primary functions on the left and the contingent functions on the right. One thing that jumps out is that the most common contingency, as you would have expected, is from self-support to family support. So self-support converts at the founder's death to help for the next generation, typically the survivors, and then the next generation and further generations. It would just go on. It would just stay in the family. Quran readings were also popular contingent destinations for wealth sheltering. A common contingency was, after I die, funds will go to support Quran readings for my soul in perpetuity. So you establish a waqf to shelter wealth for yourself in this life. When you're dead, you have the living read Quran for your soul to help you in the hereafter on the day of judgment. And you do this often for members of your family as well. Often you did both. So it's difficult to see many of the other contingencies. There's so many very thin arrows here, but I can show you these regressions for insights into the connections between primary and contingent functions. The red coefficients capture what the graph just told us, that's already been explained. What the blue coefficients here tell us something interesting. They tell us that with the small number of waqfs that actually supported worldly social services, the contingencies were likely to be otherworldly social services. So if someone was genuinely philanthropic, the contingencies were also philanthropic purposes. You see the positive coefficients here and the negative coefficients for family support and so on. So let me come to conclusions, and then we can open up to the Q&A, and I might ask Serkan if he wants to add anything after I conclude. I might have missed something important. There are huge literatures by activists, but also by scholars that treat the Waqf as an instrument of charity and redistribution. The claims in these works are based on cherry-picked case studies, and they're based on scripture. This paper uses the largest data set assembled to date of regular Waqfs to show that at least for regular Waqfs, these claims do not hold up. Waqfs tended to be founded by wealthy people for themselves in this world and the next. They preserved existing inequalities, since Waqf founders were almost always considerably more wealthy than the average person. They had to be to have the funds to invest. These preserved existing inequalities, and then they also aim to existing them to the next life. They were vehicles of obtaining security in one's lifetime and also after death. Hence the subtitle of the paper, Instrument of Unequal Security, Worldly and Otherworldly. Waqf founding choices varied across status groups, and these stemmed systematically from differences in vulnerability. The case studies of major Islamic Waqfs, invariably state Waqfs, are unrepresentative of Waqfs as a whole, most of which were founded by people outside the Sultan's inner circle. State Waqfs were small in number, but absolutely huge. And that's typically when the studies tend to focus, the case studies tend to focus on them. Islam, of course, counsels generosity, and founding a Waqf could be an expression of generosity if it was designed as philanthropic or charitable. However, usually generosity toward others was not reflected in Waqf founding choices, and there were variations across status groups, and these stemmed from differences in social, legal, economic vulnerability. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. And maybe Serkan, if you want to add anything, and then I guess we can go to Q&A.
Great. So Serkan, unless you have anything to add. Great. So then the floor is open now for questions. To avoid chaos, I suggest that those who have a question raise their hands and then unmute yourselves, or if you cannot, I'll just unmute you. Please let me know via chat. So
and I'm going to bring Serkan in also for answering the questions. We'll share them.
Great. Let me then maybe exploit my advantage as the host and ask a question. Two questions, actually. First of all, this was very, very interesting. Thank you for the seminar. I'm curious why you didn't take it one step further to inspect the effects on inequality outcomes directly. For example, of course, I don't know the scope of the data. If you have sort of geographical wise data, like, for example, as the geographical area of the courts, whether you can map it, and if you can compute some sort of inequality indices between different social classes, between males and females, which I thought would be very interesting, and see the effects of the presence of these Waqfs on inequality outcomes. Thank you.
So maybe I'll give you an answer, then Serkan can also add something. So this we in the court records for cash Waqfs, we have the amount invested. So this is something that we can actually do, and we have that coded. We do not have that for the classic Waqfs. Because the wealth endowed is real estate, the real estate is described, but no value is given. Now we are trying to this would be a separate paper, because getting into bringing in all that data would make the paper's already long. But it's something we can do. We are trying to get at this by developing a data set of housing values in neighborhoods, average housing values, and we would be able to use that and then actually talk about the sizes of the Waqfs as well. Serkan, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, so the nice thing, so although we don't have the value of house Waqfs, where the endowment is housed, we have super detailed description of houses. And in another data set, as Timur mentioned, so we know the prices. So we can estimate based on these characteristics, and we also know the locations, so we know the neighborhoods as well. So we can estimate these Waqfs, like the endowments as well. But like for some sort of inequality, actually we have so we also created some sort of an index where we look at the random probability of each, like two founders. If we pick two founders from one neighborhood by random, what's the probability that they are gonna be of different titles, which gives some sort of an information about the heterogeneity of neighborhoods. But constructing that over time is tricky, because we don't have many observations. Like we need a number of Waqfs. Like we need to have enough number of Waqfs, at least in multiple time periods, so that we can see how neighborhoods evolve over time. That's tricky.
So we do. I should add that we have locations for some of the Waqfs, but not all. And we actually, in the most demanding specification, our sample size drops because and of course we start losing significance because of the Waqf, we don't have location information. But if we increase the size of our sample, we should be able to locate, do more by using neighborhood characteristics, income characteristics, and so on. But it's very time-consuming work. But this is something that can actually be done.
Thank you.
Gözde, may I?
Yes, Ulaş, please go ahead.
Yeah. Timur Hocam ve Serkan, I have just one comment and one question. Just a little comment on the connection of the issue with the inequality. Just actually a quick clarification. This thing, I mean, this whole Waqf story tells us about the distribution of the income at the very top, right? I mean, this is basically the result. I mean, what you described in your paper is the result of the game between the ruler and a lot of wealthy people. So if it tells anything about inequality, it's just inequality within the top 1% or maybe within top 0.1% or something like that, right? This is a question slash, this was a question slash comment. And my broader question is this: you try to put this story in the framework of elites, Ottoman elites or wealthy people trying to conceal, I mean, trying to just, conceal their wealth from the ruler for the fear of confiscation or anything like that, right? So they are trying to keep their wealth for themselves or for their family or whatever. So, but I think by the way, I mean, I believe in your story, but to have a broader picture, I mean, I think it would be useful to have a general picture of how wealthy people really, try to protect their wealth in different ways. This must be one of the ways, I guess, right? Or maybe I don't know. Maybe there wasn't another way. That was, I mean, establishing a Waqf and transferring all maybe some property and some cash to the Waqf was the only way. But I guess there must have been other ways as well. I mean, I'm asking this question because if there was a working way of protecting your wealth from the ruler, and that was, I mean, just putting all these words like, these expressions or the words or the terms that you identify with the intention, with the objective of the Waqf on the paper, you try to maximize your chance of really meeting your objective, right? I mean, to protect really your wealth. If you say that, okay, I'm not gonna use it for my own purpose, I'm gonna use it for, I don't know, to feed the soldiers, maybe it doesn't work. I don't know. This must be, I mean, these letters, these documents, these foundation documents must be the result of some experimentation of the wealthy people who really had tried to protect their own wealth as well. I don't know if that's clear, but I thought that might be interesting to know more about.
Serkan, do you want to take this first? I can then come in as well.
Yeah. So I guess we should definitely have to, like, we should mention if there are other ways of sheltering wealth other than the Waqfs. Then, if there are, then it's an issue, right? So then maybe they're using those other ways to shelter wealth, and then using Waqfs just to signal that they are good people providing these public services to people. So, but to my knowledge, I don't know any, but I think that's something we should at least target in the paper. I think that's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Serkan. So first, your initial comment is, I think, well taken. In fact, the Waqfs are founded by essentially the top 1%, and we show that the benefits are going also overwhelmingly to the top 1%. So this is basically a system that preserves inequality. We are challenging a literature that treats a very large literature going back many, many decades that treats the Waqf as an instrument of philanthropy and charity, and also that does some wealth sheltering on the side. What we're suggesting is that wealth sheltering is the game. And this is part of, and this is a benefit that is enjoyed with the permission of the ruler by the elites, the most distinguished people in society. Now, on the second point, the Waqf was in fact the major way that wealthy people protected wealth. The other form was, of course, not to disclose your wealth at all, was to have wealth outside of Istanbul, and of course, state capacity was low and not reported, bribe the tax collector, and so on. There's a great deal of wealth that was kept in this form. Of course, we have no data on this. This is the alternative, but I should point out that for the top 1%, these were people who were unusually well known by the palace in Istanbul. If you had a title of Ah or Bey or Çelebi, you were a distinguished person. You lived you had a nice home with a lot of land around it. You had property. This would have been known to the Sultan. If you kept it as private property, the chances of confiscation when the Sultan suddenly needs extra resources because of a war or something, the chances were much, much higher. Waqfs did on occasion get confiscated, but it was very rare, and there was a great deal of pushback from the ulama, who themselves founded a lot of Waqfs. A good share of the elites who are founding Waqfs are actually ulama. So this is, I think, the important way. I cannot think of another way you would shelter Waqfs, a substitute for the Waqf other than just hiding your income. But it's a very good point, and we should actually, so thank you very much, Lush, for this this comment. We should actually bring it into the paper.
So there's a question from Umut Hoca. Umut Hocam, I think I've managed to unmute you.
Yes, it was a really fabulous study. It was very deep and very rich. Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, in terms of organization structure, have you found any differences between state and regular Waqfs? This is my first question. The second question is, who were caretakers? What were their main characteristics? Thank you.
Serkan, should I take this, or do you want to go ahead if you want?
Yeah, it's fine. So for caretakers, they can just nominate anyone they want. Mostly, so whenever we know who the caretaker is, we code it that way. So for instance, if the founder says, "Oh, I'm gonna be the caretaker until I die," so because that means salary. So we assumed that Waqf is for himself or herself. So whenever we know who the caretaker is, and it's mostly either it's self-support or immediate family. And maybe Hocam, you can take
yes. No, this is correct. Mostly when with these waqfs, the caretaker is the founder himself or herself while they're living, but then they designate often a child or some other relative as the next caretaker. In some of the philanthropic waqfs, they will designate somebody else who's typically a cleric. And there's a literature on how many waqfs that fell into disrepair were taken over by clerics, by the ulama. They were a major beneficiary of this system, and that's because they were typically the next caretaker. Now, on the first question, differences between state and regular waqfs, there were, in fact, that is something that merits another paper in itself. The regular waqfs were supervised by the local judge. The deeds were filed in a court in, say, the Galata court or the Bab court or the Central Istanbul court, something like that. And the judge of that court would supervise the waqfs in the vicinity of the courts. That provided, and the duty of the judge, the qadi, was to make sure that, in principle, that the deed was implemented very precisely. Of course, departures, the caretaker often wanted departures because times change, economic conditions change, technologies changed, and so on. Always required the qadi's permission, which meant that the qadi could earn rents from his supervisory position. He would demand a bribe in return to providing his permission, because he always had a veto power. Now, with state waqfs, you didn't have this because ultimately the Sultan, the ruling family, could essentially, they had a veto power because if the Shaykhul Islam tried to block an adjustment at the Süleymaniye Medrese, you could actually fire the Shaykhul Islam. But this was of course costly, and there was a limit to the types of changes you could make. I said that there was no municipality in Istanbul. You had these state waqfs. The state waqfs were not nearly as flexible as a municipality. But this is a big question, and I just touched the surface. As I said, it merits a study on its own.
Nurhan Hocam.
Okay. Timur, I have two questions, okay? One of them has to do with wealth sheltering. Now, to the extent that Gülhane Hattı Hümayunu or Tanzimat was credible, there would need to be less fear of confiscation, okay? So do you observe any decline in the number of, say, waqfs founded as the 19th century progresses? This is the first question. And the second one has to do with converts feeling vulnerable. There you made a distinction between someone who was converted as a child versus someone who converted as an adult, presumably the motive for conversion being suspect for the adult. But what about the children? I missed that point. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nurhan. On the first question, Serkant and I were just talking about this last night because it's some additional we want to make that. So I will leave that to him. Just on the converts, let me answer this. There are two types of converts, as you pointed out. Those that converted as a child were forcibly converted as a child and brought to Istanbul and those Istanbul residents, or perhaps migrants from somewhere else who converted on their own. The reason for their vulnerability was different. In one case, it's because they don't have a local family, they don't have local roots. This is why they were considered, the Yenicheris were considered, the Janissaries were considered particularly dependable because they didn't have local roots, a natural support group. With those who converted as adults, they were, there's a literature on how they were treated as suspects and perhaps not sincere. They were suspected of being Muslim in public, but privately practicing their former religion. And for this reason, they were less dependent. They were their word was considered less dependable. Of course, this must have varied from case to case, but that's why we control for them. The vast majority of the converts, of course, in our sample are the Janissaries, and people converted as child. But we do have the other kinds of the adult converts as well. But Serkan, why don't you take the second?
Yeah. So yeah, that's actually we were literally talking about that yesterday, as Timur mentioned. So I remember checking that, but the problem is, of course, there's also a secular decline over time in number of Waqfs. So Tanzimat is pretty late the after Tanzimat period, we don't have many Waqfs founded. But what we are planning to do is right now we have period fixed effects to to control for common shocks. We can just interact those period dummies with the variables of interest to see how over time motivations differ. And I think that's one thing we should definitely, and it will be interesting whether there are like particular periods where these motivations were higher or lower, and we can I think do more there. So yeah, we'll do it hopefully in the next version. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one last question from Ayça Hoca?
I have time for just one more. Unfortunately, I have to run to a department meeting very soon. It starts at 11:45, and I have to drive into work. So we can take one more. Yeah.
Great.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I love your work, Timur Hocam. Well, thank you very much. So this is very much in line. This talk was with your earlier writings. I could see, but this is kind of a deeper drill into the story. So I was wondering, I know that this is kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but it's somehow related because we're talking about lack of property rights and kind of mechanisms that people developed to shelter their wealth. So you mentioned that although 45% of the population was non-Muslim, so what they were doing because for this against this protect their property. What were they doing? Or, I mean, of course, the rulers were aware of this was a path, these Islamic Waqfs, a way to get away from the story. Of course, they were aware of this. So by regulation, was there any kind of difference in the way that they were treating, making it easier for the Muslims to, opening this path for the Muslims? Was it easier?
But I mean, this is an excellent question. There's another paper that deals with this actually in great detail. That it's a paper jointly with Aslıcan Sunar that's available on SSRN. We're just about to post a new version of it. The short answer is that the non-Muslim private property was more vulnerable to confiscation than Muslim property. But this diminished over time, and we know specifically that it diminished over time as a result of foreign protection. The Russians gained protection over the Greeks and Armenians and other people, other Ottoman subjects that belong to Eastern churches. The French eventually gained protection over the Catholics, the small numbers of Catholics, the British over the small number of Protestants, and so on. So non-Muslims got protection in that way, and we see, in fact, that protection translates into, starting in the 18th century, into a massive increase in wealth. And it happens through new markets that Greeks, Armenians, and Jews to a much, much smaller extent, but especially Greeks and Armenians, help create a big market, the Gedik market. This is something, if I get into this, it would take us a whole hour. But anyway, this disadvantage gradually disappears. And in fact, it becomes more advantageous to invest in these new markets than in putting wealth into Waqfs, which are relatively secure, but also that have a low rate of return. And so it becomes a disadvantage over time. So anyway, there are many, many complex mechanisms here. In the early period, it's definitely the case in the early, from the conquest through the 1600s, that it's a big disadvantage for non-Muslims to not be able to found Waqfs, except the very wealthiest non-Muslims who are close to the palace and provide huge gifts to the palace in return for the privilege of forming a Waqf. Muslims are able to form a Waqf at will. If they have the money, they can form a Waqf.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So thank you, Timur Hocam, for this fascinating talk, and thank you everyone for the lively discussion. So let us end the seminar here, and hoping to see you all in the next one.
But thank you very, very much, Gözden, for all of you for coming to this seminar, and for the very, very good, nice comments and questions. Unfortunately, I have to now rush to a department meeting. So good evening to all of you who are across the water.